Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo podcast. The Alamo Collection includes thousands of artifacts like documents, weapons, textiles, paintings, items that truly show you what life was like over the course of the Alamo's 300-year history. Today we reveal how those items are chosen, organized, displayed, the measures being taken to keep them in museum quality condition, and what it's like to be up close and personal with the hallmarks of history. I'm your host, Emily Baucom. We're joined by the Alamo's Collections Manager, Misty Lanham. Misty, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with describing the role of a collections manager. You play a big role in caring for the artifacts in the Alamo Collection.
I do. So we're very fortunate to have so many wonderful artifacts. And what the collections manager does is make sure that they're exactly where we think they are, that we're keeping track of them at all times, that we're making sure that they're in the best possible condition. I work with a team of 4 fantastic registrars that always keep me organized. We make sure that the paperwork for all the artifacts is how it's supposed to be, that if we have loans, that they're updated. Just lots of kind of accounting for the collection, I think.
And that's a term a lot of people haven't heard before, registrar. What does that mean?
So a registrar is a very similar position. They're also making sure that the collection is in really fantastic condition. Every now and then we'll do sort of a spot inventory to make sure that if our collection system says that an artifact is in a particular box, it is in that box, and that we have the backup paperwork for it. And so they're also very much like accountants for artifacts.
Lots of checks and balances.
Absolutely.
I've heard you say everything in the Alamo Collection needs to have intent behind it. What do you mean by that?
So it's very important to us, and I think most museums, that we don't have a storage room that's just cram-packed full of things that maybe don't have an intent or a use. So we want to make sure that the artifacts that we collect, they're either intended to go into the new museum or perhaps an exhibit, or that there is good potential for them being used for research, or perhaps they're just a really fantastic example of a particular kind of artifact that isn't found anywhere else. And so we don't want a big storage room that stays full all the time. We want our artifacts to be used. We want them to be seen by the public and shared. That's the whole point of this.
And telling the Alamo story.
Yes, absolutely.
Earlier this year, back in March, the Ralston Family Collections Center opened. It's home to the Alamo exhibit, more than 500 artifacts on display, many for the first time. And whatever you're interested in, documents, weapons, items from daily life in the 1800s, there's something for everyone.
Oh, absolutely. We have gotten such a wonderful response from the Collection Center. I believe a few months ago we hit over 100,000 visitors, which is so exciting. That we're able to share artifacts that have never been out before with the public, and that they're enjoying it so much.
And the Alamo is displaying more artifacts than ever before.
It's crazy to think about. I was going through recently, like I said, accounting the collection. And in our previous exhibit, which was over in the annex connected to Alamo Hall, we had about 90 artifacts in that whole room. And we have over 100 just in the welcome wall. So when you walk into the front doors, right in front of you is that wall where artifacts are mounted up on the wall. We have more artifacts in that space than we did in our previous museum space.
It's very impressive when you walk in. And the Collection Center truly tells the collector's journey, focusing on 3 big collectors, the Alamo, Phil Collins, and Donald in Louisiana.
And that was so important for us to tell the story of collectors, why they collect, how they collect, because so often we get asked, well, where does the Alamo get its stuff? Has it always been here? And really, if we think about the battle and the conditions after the battle, that wasn't really great for somebody going around and grabbing up things and saying, hey, somebody in the future might think this is really important. And so it's those collectors who have rediscovered the history and the artifacts who have been able to bring them back to us.
There are signs on the wall explaining the lingo that collectors use, words like provenance.
Yes, because kind of like came up earlier, there are words that we use them every single day, and we think they're very common. We know, oh, absolutely, that's what that particular thing is. But as we were going through this and designing, we were like, wait a second, maybe not everyone, especially people who aren't in the museum field, know what these things are. And it's very important for us to be able to make sure that we're speaking in terms and interpreting and have labels and things like that, that everyone is able to understand so that it helps them understand how important and cool our collection is.
And we want these artifacts to stand the test of time so future generations can learn about the Alamo story. How do the display cases help keep the artifacts in good shape?
So the display cases are really great because they create what we call a microclimate. And so within the room or the museum where we have an ambient temperature, within that little case is just its own little climate. And so they have seals that help to keep humidity out. That also helps to keep temperature a little bit more consistent. And then also within that, we're able to do certain things. So we have desiccant trays, which if you think about the little silica packets that come in a shoebox when you first buy shoes, they're kind of similar to that. They pull moisture out of the air. So we have monitors in there. If we realize that maybe the climate isn't doing exactly what we want it to do, we have some checks and balance where we're able to get that where we want it to be.
Climate control is why we no longer have these priceless artifacts on display in the Alamo Church or Lawn Barrack.
And it was very special to have them in those locations because that's where the history happened. But we also have these very fragile and delicate artifacts that we need to take the best care possible. And so the church and the Long Barrack, unfortunately, we just weren't able to control their humidity as well because those stones retain humidity and they let off moisture. And so that's where the collection center is very helpful because we're able to have better control over that.
When you walk into the collection center, there are two sets of doors with a vestibule, and there's an important reason for that.
There is. So that is actually a little bit similar to the display cases. What the exterior door does is it's of course your first entry point, and then you have the interior, and that helps to keep the climate inside of the building. So it's almost a control area, if you will, so that we're not just dumping that really great conditioned air outside, and we're also not having the humid, hot air pouring inside of the building.
What about the artifacts mounted on walls? How was special care taken for those items?
That is such a fascinating process. So what we had was we had a professional mount maker come, and the way that he designs the mounts is that he gets his hands on each artifact and he traces those artifacts and he takes a load of measurements. And then he went back to his studio and bent the mounts specifically for each artifact. And then taking pictures or on site next to the artifact, he was able to paint the mounts the exact color of the artifact so that they blend really well. So he always said, if he does a good job, you don't notice the mounts. And I think he did a really spectacular job doing that.
That's fascinating. There's science behind it and there's art. Mm-hmm. There's a whole room dedicated just to documents. And of course, documents have their own particular needs.
That is probably most of our favorite room because you can learn so much from documents. You get emotions, you get people's thoughts, maybe things that they wouldn't say out loud, but they feel comfortable writing down on paper. So documents are so special to all of us. And they do absolutely have their own unique needs because paper is so fragile. If the humidity becomes too low, then the paper becomes brittle. If it's too high, we might have to deal with mold or something like that. And so it's very important to keep the documents and also paintings, photographs, anything that might be on paper in very particular conditions so that we don't risk it.
Next to every artifact is a small sign with a short description. Who writes those?
That is such a team effort. So I will say that I came into this process a little bit late. They had already done research. They had already kind of outlined what the exhibit would look like.
Because you had a different role in the Alamo
in
the early stages of the collection center.
I did. I've been here 8 years. At that time, I was director of guest experience. And so I got to move over to this position, and we were basically in the process of implementation by the time I came here. But even at that point, we still had quite a bit of work to do. And so in regard to the labels, that was work with our graphic designer, making sure that they looked really great and that they all had kind of the same information so that they were formatted the same. The curator, Ernesto, of course, our researchers, Colby and Thomas. I worked a little bit of them. It was such a collaborative effort, just working through making sure people understand the history of the artifact, why we had it out, and maybe how it ties to a bigger theme.
You touched on this earlier that, people always ask, how does the Alamo acquire its artifacts? Because it's not like after such a deadly battle, people are picking things up and thinking, oh, I bet a couple hundred years from now, someone might be interested in this.
Unfortunately, no. It would have been really great if our forefathers had kind of had the foresight on some of these things. We hear that quite a bit with, where did the walls go? Where is the rest of the compound? It's very similar with artifacts. And so we get those in a few ways. Like Phil Collins, we can have a donation where people have acquired these over time through their family or through purchasing or something like that, and they want to make sure that it goes home and that it's taken care of perpetually. Another option is a loan. If somebody isn't quite ready maybe to make a full donation, they may do a loan, or if they want it to be able to kind of travel around, maybe they show it here, maybe they send it to another museum, and so that's another option. And then one that we don't do quite as much is there's the option to purchase. Things come up, and a lot of people think that it's kind of bizarre that sometimes letters come up on eBay or auction sites or things like that. It's like, where did these come from? They must have been in a museum or a state location. How did they get out and that sort of thing? But not everything was retained.
You may be cleaning out your grandparents' house, may
Yes.
not have any idea what you have, and put it on eBay.
Exactly. So often we hear, well, I was cleaning out my grandpa's house and there was this box underneath his bed and I opened it and there was a gun, but it wasn't like a modern gun. It was this really old gun. What is this? And then it's a treasure.
And sometimes you do have people drop things off or call you and ask questions. Hey, I have this. I don't know what it is. Can you help me?
Yes, we do. And so our research team is so fabulous about that. They have so much knowledge, and if they don't have it, they know where to find it.
That's a very good skill. We're fortunate in the Collection Center to have a conservation lab used by the Alamo's conservator and archaeologist. We're also fortunate to have a state-of-the-art vault. Now, for security reasons, we are limited on what we can say about it, but can you tell us how you care for artifacts that are in the vault?
So to me, when I think about a vault, this may be a funny comparison, but I almost think about a bedroom, if you will. It is the place where the artifacts go and they rest. They go and they have either a shelf or they have a box that has padding or foam that's very particular to their shape and their needs and supports them just perfectly. And it's either dark or very dim, and it's nice and cool and dry and all the conditions that an artifact needs. So it's their opportunity to go behind the scenes and take a little break.
I like that analogy, like a bedroom. A fun new feature people can't see in the Collection Center is a cannonball wall on the second floor just when you get off the staircase. It's become a bit of a selfie wall, but those are all real cannonballs.
They absolutely are, and gosh, that was a process, but it was so interesting to see how that went in, because the wall behind it, of course, had some brilliant engineers to figure out what would hold that much weight. There are so many cannonballs. I believe there's about 200 cannonballs. The wall weighs over 1,500 pounds. That's why you needed that engineering behind it. The largest cannonballs are 18-pounders, like the cannon that was shot the first day of the battle, and the smallest ones are just a few ounces. And whenever we received those, they were in this massive crate, and it had to be hauled in with some sort of special lift because it was so heavy. And whenever those cannonballs were first cast, they were done by our friends up at Hearn, which has done a couple of our cannons, and they were brand new shiny cannonballs. And that wasn't exactly the look that we were hoping for. And so Hearn sprayed, I can't be sure exactly what it was, some sort of chemical on them, closed up that crate, shipped it. So by the time it got here, they kind of had a corroded, rusty look, but we didn't want the rust to rub off on anyone, and we also wanted a little bit more polished, not brand new, but just slightly more polished. So we went through and we stained the cannonballs, and we sanded them down in some areas, and we did this full treatment process. And I will tell you, after that, because there were so many of them and they're so heavy, my arms, they felt like they were so buff, but then at the same time, like I had no strength. They were so exhausted.
Lots of elbow grease and putting together
my
this
gosh,
cannonball wall. And that's an important point. You do want people to touch these.
Yes, please touch them. It's so rare to have an opportunity. I know that people really love being able to hold them when Living History takes them out. And so this is an opportunity. Go get an idea of the varying sizes of the cannonballs.
Could you actually fire these cannonballs if you wanted to?
We actually have some hopes for the future that might be possible. They are cannonballs. Actually, anything you could pretty much shove down the barrel of a cannon and shoot it, so long as it wouldn't melt. But what we're hoping is that in the future, if we don't use this wall, because we do have cannons and we hope to make more cannon programming, that we would be able to either unscrew these or cut these off of the walls and use them as they were intended, projectiles.
Okay, cannon enthusiasts, stay tuned. Misty, it's been your dream for many years to work in a museum environment. Now that you help care for the Alamo's collection, do you ever just have a pinch me moment or moments where you're truly humbled by what you're caring for?
I think the biggest one that I have is when I walk into the church. I think that employees of the Alamo have this really fantastic and fortunate opportunity that most don't, and that every morning I can walk into the church and be the first one in there, and it's quiet and it's dim, and I mean, it smells a little bit like a cave in there, but that's the stone and the history and all of these things. And you just really feel the weight and the presence of history all
It's
around
interesting you brought up the smell, because I've had visitors tell me that you can smell the battle still.
I mean, I feel like you get so many different sensory things whenever you walk in there.
As we wrap up, going to put the collections manager on the spot for a second. Do you have a favorite artifact in the Alamo collection?
Oh, this is terrible. I love them all like my children. But it changes. As we pull things to put on exhibit, or as we're moving things around, or maybe we're paying particular attention to an artifact because we're rehousing it or reboxing it or something like that. In that moment, that's my favorite artifact. Because you take in the history and you're really getting a close look at it, and it's like, this is just fantastic. I will say at this moment, I'll share what my favorite is. On the way to family vacation this summer, my husband and I listened to 9 Years with the Indians, which was written by Herman Lanham, and it's about a young German boy who lived out in the hill country, and he was taken by the Comanche and lived with them for 9 years. And recently, we were going through the vaults because we just had the big move over to the collection center, and I saw a tag on a gun, and it said Herman Lehman. I said, wait a second, this one? Thankfully, Ernesto was there, and he was like, yes, that one. And I just couldn't believe it, because that book told so many stories about when he used that, when they were raiding or when they were attacked or when he was hunting or something like that. And so to know that we have that in the collection is so exciting.
Such a light bulb moment. And I do want to go back to something you just said. You said we're constantly bringing new artifacts out of the vault and putting them on display, so you have new favorites. And that's a good point, that collection center, museums, they're not just for old things that we put out there once. They're living facilities.
Absolutely. So if you came to the Alamo last year, you should come back, because we are changing things, we're moving things around, and part of that is conservation. Especially with documents, they're only supposed to be out a short amount of time before they go back to the vault and have their rest. And so we're switching those out as we get new loans or as we get donations or artifacts coming in and we feel like they help us to tell the story. We may do a swap out, or we may add some artifacts. And so the collection center that you saw back in March is not exactly the same as it is today or as it will be in a couple weeks.
Misty Lanham, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
In the podcast notes for this episode, we've linked to more information on the Ralston Family Collections Center. Again, it's the home of the Alamo exhibit, more than 500 artifacts on display. You can watch a short video showing the highlights, and you can also plan your visit. While most of the Alamo is free to visit, you do need to buy a ticket to the collection center. But we offer discounts to seniors, service members, and first responders. And it's free for Friends of the Alamo members. So we'll also include a link in the podcast notes for you to join our membership program. Even if you don't live in the San Antonio area, it's a great way to support the conservation and preservation work constantly taking place at the Alamo. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.